Andre Leu is president of iPhone Organics International. His goal is the worldwide adoption of ecologically, socially, and economically sound organic agriculture. He has 50 years' experience in all areas of organic agriculture, including growing, pest control, weed management, new crops, and education. Although not a scientist per se, he has used his knowledge to investigate and review peer-reviewed science around pesticides. He has published extensively in newspapers, journals, websites, and with his own internationally acclaimed book, The Myth of Safe Pesticides. Welcome, Andre.
Thank you.
We have a lag in speaking with Andre because I'm in Los Angeles and he's in Australia. We're having this conversation with Andre because so many people are just not informed about the use of pesticides and other chemical poisons in our food supply. Andre, how many pesticides do you estimate that there are?
There are thousands and thousands, particularly when we look at the formulations that are used. For instance, in the United States, there are about 1,400 that are used. In my country, Australia, there are 7,200. In the European Union, there would be a similar amount. And everywhere we go around the world, these formulations are slightly different. And the fact is, not one, and I will say this again, not one has been tested for chronic long-term diseases.
Wow, that's incredible. What does that, I know you in your book, you talk about rigorously tested means. What is it? What does it actually mean when the literature says it's been rigorously tested?
Well, in my book, I show how that is a myth. What they test is what they call the active ingredient, the main ingredient, which in many cases is less than 1% in a pesticide. The pesticides that are used by farmers are formulations that use this active ingredient, say glyphosate, which is the main active ingredient of Roundup, or malathion, which is the active ingredient of many pesticides. And then they add synergists to it to make it work stronger, different adjuvants and a whole range of other toxic chemicals that they call inerts. Many of these chemicals are solvents and petrochemicals, most of which we know in their own right are carcinogens. And yet, this cocktail of toxic compounds, about the only thing they test it for is acute toxicity. In other words, how much you need to die within 2 weeks. There is some testing for that. But when we look at all the other diseases we can get from pesticides, such as cancer, such as nerve damage, such as damaging our endocrine, our hormone system, birth defects, and multiple long-term diseases, there is absolutely no testing done by any regulatory authority anywhere in the world.
Anywhere in the world?
Anywhere in the world, not one.
What percentage of food samples do have pesticide residues?
When you average them out, about over 70% will have residues. And when I say this is a little bit sneaky too, because there, as far as I can see, there has not been one sampling of food that has looked at all the pesticides. They just do a snapshot and they might look at a few hundred of the thousands that are used. So, just to say that 70% have residues is not very truthful, because they haven't looked at all the pesticides. So how do they know the other 30% don't have these other pesticides? And the example I'll give is the USDA studies. Every year they'll come out and they'll use a sample. They have never, and that includes the latest one this year, in January this year, on January 11, they have never tested for glyphosate, the most common herbicide used in the United States. Not one test has looked for that.
That's incredible. You mentioned earlier that the toxic chemicals have a synergistic effect, or what I call an entourage effect with each other. How does that work?
Well, what we know now, see what happens when regulatory authorities approve a pesticide, they just don't approve one, for a crop. They'll approve multiples. And when we use pesticides, this is a generic word for insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, miticides, and there will be several of these approved. In fact, many of these are approved with the expectation that all of them will be used in the normal crop cycle, the normal production of a crop. So you'll have some herbicides, you'll have insecticides, you'll have fungicides. And so when you do a testing of most produce, you actually have multiple pesticide residues. What we know is that they work synergistically, and the best way to explain it is that, an additive effect is when 1 and 1 makes 2. Synergism is where it's even stronger. So 1 and 1 can make 3 or 4 or 5. And some of the studies we've looked at, 1 and 1 can make more than 1,000 in terms of its toxic effect.
The effect of the pesticides, can you comment on what it's doing to the soil?
What we know, is that it's killing the soil. The soil is not dirt. Soil is actually made of living organisms. Soil organic matter, we know now, is one of the critical parts of the soil. In the organic industry, we have always known that. And building up soil organic matter has been critical to our management of the soil. In fact, that's why we're called the organic farming. It's building up this organic matter. And the organic matter is where all the life is. In fact, it has the highest biodiversity on the planet. Just a teaspoon of soil will contain millions of life forms. And, millions and millions and millions of species. In fact, it's billions, we know. Nowhere else in the world do you have this sort of biodiversity. And it's very important for getting nutrients to the plants, for protecting plants from diseases. And when we poison it with pesticides, and that's what they are, we kill all these beneficials. So you end up with these soils that are not quite dead, but instead of having billions and millions of organisms, it actually starts to go down to thousands and hundreds, the biodiversity. And many of those that remain are what we call pathogenic. They're the ones that cause all these diseases in plants instead of being beneficial. So it changes the whole biology, and you end up with an agriculture now that is totally reliant on synthetic poisons to produce our food.
So it's affecting our soil, and it affects the plants. It affects the plants by the shikimate pathway. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, but that's one of the ways. That's the way Roundup works. The shikimate pathway, or shikimate pathway, depending on how you want to pronounce it, it synthesizes the aromatic compounds, particularly the phenolics. Many of these are antioxidants, but they are essential for plants to live. And in this case, glyphosate, Roundup, blocks that. But other pesticides work in other ways, and they block multiple other pathways in plants, and that way they can work as herbicides and kill weeds. Other pesticides are insecticides, and they actually damage the nervous system or other pathways in insects. But we know they also damage microorganisms, particularly fungicides. That's the whole purpose of them, is to kill fungi, and yet we know that most of the fungi in the soil are beneficial. So very important for getting nutrients, particularly phosphorus to plants, and they're also very important for protecting plants from diseases, and also very important for building up soil organic matter, building the health of the soil. So when we put the poisons in there, we kill them. And it's not rocket science. These things, they're poisons. We're using them as poisons, so it shouldn't come as a surprise. The poisons actually poison living things like soil microorganisms.
Yes, and so the plants themselves are not healthy. They don't have the same nutrient quantity. So you're not getting a robust food source. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's very correct. And we have good science on that now, particularly recently, the largest comparison study of conventional and organic foods was done by Newcastle University. They looked at over 200 comparison studies. And what they clearly found is that there is a massive difference in nutrition between organic and conventional. And when it comes to these phenolic antioxidants, these are the compounds that protect us from degenerative diseases like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, all the diseases that we're seeing, that are largely an epidemic in the modern age. What we find is these phenolics will protect and also help reverse these diseases. So these are largely missing or much lower in conventional foods. They're 30 to 40% greater in organic. So eating organic food, as well as avoiding the dangers of pesticides, has multiple benefits in protecting you from degenerative diseases and also reversing them.
Can you wash these pesticides and fungicides off of sprayed food sources?
And the answer is no. This is one of the big myths. You just need to wash it off. For a start, most of them are applied with stickers, so that these what are called sticking compounds. So when it rains, they don't get washed off anyway.
Right.
But many of them are what we call systemic, and that means that it gets absorbed by the plant and taken up by the whole plant, so that when the insect bites a leaf or the fruit or whatever, it dies. It gets poisoned. So there's enough poison in these products to kill insects, and yet, so you can't wash it off. And yet we're supposed to believe that that amount of poison that can kill insects is safe for us and safe for our children.
Right. Well, I think that's a general misconception of probably most people listening, is that you can just wash it off.
And the answer is, in most cases, you can't. Peeling will remove, some of the surface chemicals, but in fact, there's so many of them. For instance, glyphosate, for instance, is systemic. Many of the organophosphates, these are nerve poisons, are systemic. And to give you an example of something like dimethoate, which is used for fruit flies, the fruit flies lay their eggs in the fruit, and when they hatch, they make these little maggots in the fruit, so that they're not really saleable. The fact that the poisons can't kill the eggs, what they have to do is the poison has to be in the fruit and strong enough, because the eggs can take up to 2 weeks to hatch. Yet 2 weeks later, there's enough poison in that fruit that when the eggs hatch, the maggots will get killed when they eat the fruit. So we're supposed to believe that fruit, 2 weeks later, which is enough poison to kill these insects, is safe for our children.
Right. We've been told that these products degrade over time, so that they're going to be harmless. Is that true?
And the answer is, once again, it's another myth. Many of these products, when they degrade, actually become more toxic. And I'll use the example of dimethoate again, which is the systemic poison used, in many of our foods to kill fruit flies and other bugs. When it degrades, like all the organophosphates, which is one of the most common groups, they form these oxons. And the oxons are usually around 100 times more toxic. And dimethoate, when it degrades, it actually forms another poison. It's actually used as a pesticide called omethiate, which is its oxon. And this is substantially more toxic. In fact, it's been banned in many places in the world as an insecticide. So the fact is, with most foods that have been treated with organophosphates, over time, they actually become more toxic, not less toxic. It's the same with the neonicotinoids, the group of chemicals that are, have been in the news for killing bees and also birds. There's a lot of science now showing the damage that they're causing to the environment. Europe has restricted their use because of it. Most other countries haven't. And that is because they say that they're very safe. But when they break down, they actually form these metabolites, which are incredibly toxic, and we actually know that will cross the blood-brain barrier and actually cause brain damage. And this is particularly important when it comes to children and the unborn, the developing fetus. As they're developing their brains, these types of chemicals cause irreparable damage to their nervous systems.
I was shocked to read that within 18 hours of being sprayed, you can find changes in placental cells. Is that something of that nature?
Yes, look, there's quite a lot of studies now showing how these chemicals can actually not only cross the blood, placental barrier, and go from mum into the developing fetus. We also know that they can actually damage the placental cells. Roundup, for instance, there's very good science on that, showing the damage that the smallest amounts will do to placental cells. And in many cases, actually, we know they can lead to miscarriages. There's been, before this work was done, there was a lot of evidence of women in rural communities where Roundup was used, were having a higher level of miscarriages. And after this study was done, it actually showed that one of the reasons for that is the damage to the placental cells. I suppose the greater worry is in the case where there isn't a miscarriage, what the damage is being done to the fetus when these products go and affect the fetal cells as well of the developing fetus.
Right. So when there's testing by the governmental officials, do they make a recommendation that differs for children and for adults as to what is safe?
This is the big problem. The answer is no. In the US, there's supposed to be a factor of 10. They'll reduce it by a factor of 10 to take children into account. But this is really a data-free assumption. There is no actual testing done that is specific to young children and particularly the developing fetus. The time when all living creatures and particularly children, people, are most vulnerable to the smallest amounts of pesticides. There is no requirement for any specific testing, or the testing is done on adolescent to older animals. What we know, for instance, is that as an adult and as an adolescent, our livers put out compounds that will break down these pesticides. So the effect isn't so great. But the fetus, the newborn and young children do not have these protective compounds in their livers. So the smallest amounts can cause massive damage because their body can't break it down in the same way as an adult. And for this reason, we need to actually test these compounds on, the equivalent of the unborn and young children receiving effects. In particular, I think what we know now is that we can actually use human cell lines rather than animals in many cases and test it directly to see what the toxicity is.
So a lot of the developmental problems that we're seeing with attention deficit or autistic spectrum disorder and some degrees of physical incoordination and depression and mood disorders, they can all be affected or accelerated or exaggerated by these pesticides. Is that correct?
Exactly. That is very correct. And we have the data now showing how many pesticides do this. For instance, if you go to pesticides like organophosphates, the pyrethroids, the neonicotinoids, carbamates, these are nerve poisons. They affect and damage the nervous system. So when you know, the fetus is developing or the young child is developing, you know, small amounts of these pesticides will affect the way, you know, nerves grow. They're called neurotoxins. They actually poison nerve cells, damage them. And of course, the brain is our largest collection of nerve cells, and the brain is, you know, really developing until we are in our mid-20s. And you know, any of these toxins will actually affect the development of the brain. The real critical time is from, you know, the time of conception through to 4 years old, and we know that the smallest amount of these pesticides can cause, you know, massive problems in the development of the brain. And one of the studies actually shows no lower limit. I couldn't find a low limit where it was safe. There's other studies that can actually, because now we have better methodologies, and you can use MRI scans to actually look at the brain and do comparisons. And these studies can clearly show areas of physical brain damage because, you know, mother had eaten food with organophosphates with pesticides in it.
Actually,
that possibly damaged the developing baby.
Two thoughts come to mind, Andre. One is that I was shocked to hear that for a person just opening up some of these pesticides and applying them to their garden, just by inhaling the pesticides, you can be affected by it.
Yeah, exactly. Just inhaling it, you know, you can be affected by it. You know, around the home, you know, people use bug sprays around the home, you know, and not only that, you know, as these pesticides sort of vaporize in the air, your skin will absorb it as well. And the skin, of course, is our largest organism. Sometimes we find that, in fact, in many cases, you find that more gets absorbed through your skin than even what you inhale. So using pesticides and bug sprays in the garden around the home is a major cause of diseases. We know, for instance, that it's probably one of the main causes of leukemia and other blood cancers in children because parents use bug sprays in the house and, you know, garden sprays in the garden.
But it's not just the parents. The playgrounds are being sprayed, and parks are being sprayed. They're being sprayed with the same toxic chemicals, isn't that right?
Exactly. And now there's some diseases like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma now we're seeing in teenagers and young adults. And in many cases, because the playgrounds and parks were sprayed or the sidewalks were sprayed, you know, this is a real issue. There's no need to spray any of these things around the house and the garden or in parks and in parks. You know, we have enough knowledge that we can look after gardens, we can look after parks, we can look after sidewalks without spraying poisons. You know, we've done it for thousands of years. Why do we need to do it now?
Right. You talked about neurologic issues, brain issues. How about the endocrine system?
This is the other really critical one now that we know there are hundreds and hundreds of compounds that are actually more toxic the smaller the doses. What happens is when they go down to very small doses, they start to work like hormones, and they actually bind, you know, with the hormone receptors in our body, and then they send out false signals. The body thinks it's a hormone and reacts to it when in fact they're not a hormone. So it disrupts our normal hormone system. And in many cases, these can be as low as 1 part per billion or even parts per trillion. And if people want to get a concept of what a part per trillion is, if I had 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools full of water, added 1 drop to it, that's a part per trillion. Or another example, if I had a train that was 10 miles long, each of those carriages, you know, was one of the carriages full of water, and 1 drop of that in that is a part per trillion. So it is the smallest amount can cause these problems. Where we know it is the most significant problem is, once again, is the developing fetus and the young, because as they develop, it's actually small amounts of hormones that give signals to the genes to develop our body parts, say our arms, our eyes, our reproductive systems, our nervous system. And if these synthetic chemicals are in the body at certain times, and they can send out the wrong signal to the gene, and so the gene will then develop in the wrong way. And we know now that there are many diseases that have been caused by small amounts of these chemicals. And an example of that is the current obesity epidemic that we see around the world. It's not just because people are eating more junk food. It is also because their metabolism has changed. Instead of eating this food and turning it into glucose and using it for energy, it automatically gets turned into fat. And there's a lot of evidence now that this epidemic of childhood obesity is actually due to endocrine disruption of these chemicals that pass the placenta, and affected these children when they were still developing in the womb.
Yes, I had a conversation with Dr. Bruce Blumberg recently at UC Irvine, who studies obesogens, and he actually commented that the obesogens stay. They're doing animal studies, but the obesogens actually stay in the organisms 4 generations down the line. It's not just an effect of the current generation.
Look, this is what we're learning with what we call epigenetics now. And epigenetics is where these chemicals and stress, there's a whole range of things, will affect essentially it's a layer on the outside of the DNA. It doesn't change the DNA, but these are called methylation and histone regions. And these chemicals actually affect that. And what that does, it affects the way the genes work. It can turn genes off. It can cause them to what we call overexpress. In other words, become more active, or underexpress, become underactive. So it affects the normal functioning of genes, and then as the child develops, there's a whole range of problems from this. And we know that these are heritable. So as you were told, the studies show it can last for 4 generations. So, people who are being affected now, it could be what their grandmother or grandfather ate. We know too that it can be passed on by the father as well, not just the mum. What dad does, that gets passed on in his sperm as well.
Going back a step, Andre, are pesticides and all these herbicides and fungicides, are they absolutely essential to farming?
The answer is no. For a very long time, organic farming was ignored by the scientific community. But now we're getting good research into it. And this research is showing that we can get equal to higher yields than conventional farming without using any of these toxic chemicals. And this is very good news. This is the good news story. We have the ability and the knowledge to change farming to make it highly productive, cost-effective for farmers, and completely non-toxic for consumers. And not only non-toxic, we know that the food will be more nutritious and better. This is a win-win situation, and we need to shift our research funding into organic. We need to shift other funding into training farmers and teaching them how to produce food with these new organic methods so that we can have the volume of food that we need for the world, but most importantly now we'll have the quality of food.
What is the single most important message that you'd like to leave with our listeners today?
My message is this, if you think organic food is expensive, what is the cost of conventional food when we know that these chemicals are affecting your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and giving them health problems for generations. How expensive is that? That is too expensive. And we know the simplest way to avoid all this damage is to eat organic food. That's the message. The other thing I'd like to say too, by going and buying organic food, you're changing the market. The corporations, farmers, they will be forced now to start growing organic food to meet the market demand. So as a consumer, that is our strongest way of changing things. That's a choice we can make. Buy organic, and by doing that, it's actually quite revolutionary. We'll change the world into a better world.
That's a wonderful message to leave everybody with. I wholeheartedly support that. I think people, that's the one comment I always get from my clients. They say, well, you know, it's so expensive to eat organic. And I ask them about the emotional expense, the monetary expense, the worry of having an individual or multiple individuals in your family who have to be hospitalized or have to be run back and forth to the doctor, or the drugs that they have to take. So, you know, again, please pick up a copy of Andre's book, The Myths of Safe Pesticides. It's a must-read for anyone concerned about your health and well-being and the health and well-being of your children and grandchildren. Andre, it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
It's been a pleasure as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And everybody, get that book and be educated and make a change in your life. Thank you. So as I was leaving Andre Leu this afternoon, he mentioned to me he has a new book coming out. I'd like you all to look for it on Amazon. Andre, can you mention the name of the book?
The book will be called The book will be called Why Are They Poisoning Our Children? The Parent's Guide to the Myths of Safe Pesticides. And this one will be focused on children's health and how the smallest amounts of pesticides are damaging the health of our children. It's written for moms and pops so that they can understand the importance of making sure that their children avoid having toxic pesticides.
Very important message. Thank you so much, Andre.